all this stuff, I think, is going to be a perfect storm to really blow up that fiscal time bomb that is so apparent. And when you look at what just happened with the deficit and the suspension of the debt ceiling, the de-dollarization is not just about the sanctions on Russia. It's also about the enormity of the debt.
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
Anyway, though, getting back to the markets. Now, first of all, over this 3-day holiday weekend, the national debt finally shot above $32 trillion. Now, at the moment, there is no ceiling on this debt. The sky's the limit because they suspended the ceiling at least until after the 2024 presidential election. So who knows how high this number is going to be. But what's really significant, it's not just the size of the debt, but what's really growing exponentially is the interest payments on the debt, which are over 600 billion according to this nationaldebtclock.org. I have a feeling that it's actually more than that, because if you look at 5 billion, that still represents less than 2% interest on the $32 trillion national debt. Now, I know a lot of that debt was financed at very, very low rates, but every month that super low yielding paper matures and it has to be replaced with 5%. And just think about what will happen. Let's say interest rates just stay around 5%. I think they're headed higher, even if they dip a little bit first. I think 5% is going to look low at some point. But let's just say rates stay around 5%. The national debt is going to be 40 trillion in a few more years, right? Not that many. At 5%, because by the time the national debt is 40 trillion, the whole thing would have rolled over. There'll be no more of that, 25 basis point debt on the Fed's balance sheet or on the government's balance sheet anymore. It'll all be gone. So if you figure the government ends up paying 5% on a $40 trillion national debt, that's $2 trillion a year in interest. That is more than triple the current 600 billion. That's more than we spend on Medicaid right now. That's more than we spend on Social Security. It's actually about what we spend on Social Security and national defense combined. And that's just interest. That's 2 trillion. But another very troubling fact should be that even if we could balance the budget without interest, meaning that the government collected enough in taxes to pay its bills, not counting interest. Even if the government could do that, we would still have a deficit of 2 trillion a year, which it can't. If you look right now, federal tax revenue is about 4.7 trillion. Spending is 6.3 trillion. Even if you subtract the 600 billion for interest on the national debt, you still have an operating deficit of $1 trillion. Even if there was no national debt and no interest to pay, we still have $1 trillion deficit, budget deficit every year, adding to the national debt. So that means if the government can maintain that $1 trillion deficit, which I doubt it can do, it's about to skyrocket as the economy, collapses into recession, or a deeper recession than what we got now. But even if we can maintain that, that means when interest on the debt is 2 trillion, the annual budget deficits will be $3 trillion a year. I mean, this is, going ballistic. Clearly, an accident is about to happen. We cannot continue this. And in fact, if you look at the rate in which we are currently racking up debt, when Biden took office about 2.5 years ago. Since then, the national debt is up 4.25 trillion in 2.5 years. But it's now going to accelerate at a rapid pace. Now, Donald Trump currently holds the record for the most debt accumulated in a single presidential term, right? He didn't accumulate the most debt of any president. That dubious distinction goes to Barack Obama. But Barack Obama served 2 terms. Trump only had 1. Now, of course, Barack Obama broke the record that was set by George W. Bush, who had the 2 terms before him. He had the record for the most debt. I mean, he doubled the debt, and then Biden doubled the debt again. Trump wasn't in office long enough to fully double the debt, but he did set a record for the most debt in a single term. I think Biden can beat that. I think that Biden in his first term, and hopefully it's his last term and only term, but in this term, based on what I think is going to happen to the deficit in the next year and a half, and interest on the debt, he is going to break the Trump record, which is very significant because remember, Trump's deficits were heavily skewed in his last year based on all the stimulus from COVID, all of the PPP money and all those stimulus checks caused the deficit to skyrocket in 2020. And so Biden, didn't have that. Yet he still is likely to preside over a bigger increase in the national debt than Trump. And by the way, I want to just mention something without actually mentioning it, because, I've heard that when you talk about this stuff, let's say on YouTube, and my podcasts are on YouTube, there's some kind of algorithms that are, kind of monitoring YouTube. And when they pick up these keywords, they kind of demonetize your video or they try to suppress its views. And so I don't want to, touch off any hot buttons, but there was a news story, and a lot of people might not have heard it because it didn't get a lot of coverage. But when that certain, disease hit in 2020, that caused the big increase in the deficit, there were a lot of people that were claiming that certain disease actually got started in a certain lab in a certain country where they were doing certain kinds of research. And so it was kind of a man-made thing. And when those theories were first, promoted, it was fake news, disinformation, conspiracy theory. But now it seems like that, conspiracy theory turns out to have been correct. But even though we now know it's correct, you still can't talk about it, right? Because the powers that be don't want to acknowledge the mistakes that they made. But apparently, not only the first person who got that disease, patient 0, but the second and third person who got that disease all worked in that lab in that country where supposedly the disease didn't emanate, except all the initial cases of that disease were in that exact lab in that exact country. So, I thought that was an interesting piece of news that I don't want to technically talk about, but I just kind of got off track. I was talking about the deficits, and that even though Biden didn't have to deal with that situation, he still is going to preside over a bigger increase in the debt than Trump did. And so this is a fiscal powder keg. All it needs is a fuse, and it's going to go off. And I think it's got to be this next downturn that is coming. I mean, the global economy, everybody is feeling the impact of rising interest rates, right? We're in like the lull before the storm. Although there was news over the weekend out of China, the Chinese economy growth is slowing, unemployment is picking up. In fact, they even had some rate cuts already in China, right? To try to stimulate the economy, right? This is just the beginning. But these problems are worldwide because of 12 years of artificially low interest rates and the malinvestments and bubbles and debt that were a byproduct of that era. As rates have been allowed to rise, all of those mistakes are rising to the surface, and we're just beginning to experience the consequences. There is another leg coming very quickly in the financial crisis here in the United States, in the banking crisis. Now, you wouldn't know it by looking at the stock market, right? I mean, yeah, the Dow was down a couple hundred points today, maybe 250, but Nvidia made a new high, right? So, hey, everything is great. And the tech stocks, the Nasdaq was down a little bit today, but not as much as the broader market because people are still piling into these stocks as if everything was great. But everything isn't even close to being great. And I think what's going to happen as we see the weakness in the economy and at the same time an uptick in inflation, which is very close around the corner. Looking at various prices, you can see that curve is bending up as the economy is headed down. That is going to put enormous pressure on the deficits of the United States and more downward pressure on the dollar. The dollar to me is still looking very weak. It's not rallying on all this talk of tight money and an aggressive Fed. The dollar is not getting a boost, but all this stuff I think is going to be a perfect storm to really blow up that fiscal time bomb that is so apparent. And when you look at what just happened with the deficit and the suspension of the debt ceiling, the creditors are figuring this out. The de-dollarization is not just about the sanctions on Russia. It's also about the enormity of the debt and the fact that our creditors want out. They don't want to be aboard this ship when it sinks.